Now we're going to turn to Massachusetts. Jury selection is underway in Court TV's newest trial, the Body in the Basement trial. Cara Rintala is set to stand trial for the fourth time, that's right, fourth time, for her wife's murder back in 2010. The victim was found beaten and strangled in the couple's basement.
This comes after 2 mistrials and 1 overturned murder conviction. The bizarre twist in this case is that when first responders arrived, both the victim and the defendant were covered in paint. Court TV's Vinnie Politan takes a look back at the case.
In 2016, a jury convicted Cara Rintala of murder in the first degree for the killing of her wife, Anna Marie Rintala.
They had this tumultuous relationship. You know, they accused each other of crimes. Anna Marie fraudulently used her credit card and ran up $20,000 in debt. They went to court and asked for restraining orders against each other.
But on March 29, 2010, the 2 paramedics were once again a couple. And that day, Anna Marie was found dead at the bottom of the stairs in their basement. She had bruises, multiple blunt injuries to her head, and had died from strangulation.
Given the number of bruises practically from head to toe, given the wounds to her head, that was entirely consistent with a tumble down the stairs.
There was pinkish white paint all over Anna Marie and the floor, the Glidden ceiling paint bucket nearby. NBC's Dateline spoke to one of the responding officers.
There was Cara Rintala sitting on the floor with a female, looked like a female party, across her lap.
And something truly weird.
Paint all over the place, all over this female that she had across her lap.
Juries deadlocked at Rintala's first 2 trials, but at the third one, a jury found her guilty. The difference in that trial was that the Commonwealth presented a paint expert. Catherine Judson, executive director of the Center for Integrity in Forensic Sciences, explains what the Glidden paint engineer testified to on the stand.
He testified about his opinion about how long the paint had been at the crime scene. He speculated about the things he knew about paint drying.
Rintala gave police her timeline of the day of the murder.
Anna Marie came home from work at about 8 a.m. She was called by the fire department to come back in. She went back in, but then they told her she wasn't needed, so she once again returned home. She arrived at about 11 a.m. Cara and her 2-year-old daughter left the house at 3 p.m. Cara and her daughter ran some errands. They arrived home at 7 p.m.
But prosecutors say Rintala's timeline does not fit with the facts of the case. The medical examiner found Anna Marie likely died between noon and 2 p.m.
The Commonwealth used their paint expert to compare the time of Anna Marie's death to when the paint was poured at the crime scene. Now, this is the same type of paint. It's Glidden ceiling paint. And what's interesting is when you apply this paint, you see that it goes on pink. And when it dries, it turns white. First responders, when they came to the scene, they saw pink in the paint that wasn't all the way dry. So the prosecution's theory is that the paint was poured less than 2 hours before police arrived to cover up the evidence at the scene.
After Rintala was found guilty of murder in 2016, her attorneys appealed. They asked the Center for Integrity and Forensic Sciences to explain to the Supreme Judicial Court flaws they saw in the paint expert's analysis.
None of his tests involved puddles of paint on concrete. In his sole experiment where he used thick layers of paint like you would expect in a puddle, that paint never dried. But it's even more complicated than that because this analysis also required that he take into account a human body, which he didn't do.
The guilty verdict was overturned, and Rintala maintains her innocence.
We concede that Mr. Rintala had the opportunity to commit the crime. What we can't concede, and what the Commonwealth continues to press, is that she's the only person that had the opportunity to commit the crime.
I'd like to welcome our guest for this hour, criminal defense attorney, former prosecutor Nicole DeBoard. Nicole, so I think it's a pretty good argument to say opportunity, really important. This is the only person who had the opportunity, therefore she's the one that committed the murder. What are your thoughts?
I think that's true, but it sounds like there may be some element of a possible accident at play here. And it sounds like the prosecution's theory is to try to debunk that accident theory with the idea that they're being lied to somehow about the timing of when she found her and how this paint got dispersed onto the floor and then also onto the victim's body. And if you call an expert to say things are scientifically so, but that supposed expert does not have the scientific foundation for making those claims, you have a big problem in a court of law. And I think that's what the prosecution is stuck with in this case.
You know, what's interesting as far as the accident goes, the reason this was turned into a homicide was because they found that she had been strangled to death. So they knew that it wasn't an accident. So the idea of opportunity became very important. And the more important thing was time of death. That's something the defense has tried to actually get thrown out, the ME's determination of time of death. I don't know if you've ever had to deal with that, but how difficult is that when you have an ME who's saying the time of death is between 1 or I think it was maybe 12 and 2, which works very well for the prosecution's case, or if it was later, which works better for the defense's case. How do you attack them in that way?
That's also going to be your science, right? So you're going to have potentially dueling experts to come in and say, well, what you're saying about the timing just simply cannot be proven. This is nothing more than a guess. And then you have to break down the details as to why that ME is making the claims that they are about what the timing of the death is said to be. A lot of times you're looking at food content, digestion of food content. Sometimes you can be looking at chemicals in the body. You can be looking at the way the blood has settled out in the positioning of the body, whether or not the body has a certain rigor mortis. There are all kinds of things that an expert can use to try to time the death, but many times this information is not quite as reliable as law enforcement would initially hope in terms of trying to put a case together. It can be subject to a lot of interpretation.
How many times does a state try a defendant? Because we know hung jury on the first 2 trials, of course, the murder conviction overturned by the appellate level for the 3rd trial. Now we're on the 4th trial. So Nicole, at what point do you think a state says, no more, this is something we're gonna let go, versus no, we believe she did it and we are gonna continue until we get a conviction that stands?
It's such a great question. And, the crass way to put it is it's a question of resources, quite frankly. The state has taken up a courtroom and jurors' time and law enforcement officials and witnesses' time to come in and make this presentation. So many times in this case, you're looking at trial number 4, and each time this means that courtroom and those law enforcement individuals and experts are no longer available to other cases, and they have to make a decision about expense and whether or not this case can come out any differently if tried yet again.
And resources are important, but I also wonder, Michael, how much it matters if victim's family continues to advocate and push and say we want justice, or if, does that play a role?
Yeah, I think it absolutely does. And I think more and more as we move forward in the system, the victims are taken into account in those types of decisions. This is the kind of case, though, that I could see them trying a number of times. I mean, because there's a lot there. And that's what I want to go into now with you, Nicole. Not only do they have these issues of the paint and whatnot, but these two had a very, very tempestuous relationship. There were mutual abuse on both sides. They both had restraining orders against each other. You had one, the victim in this case, who I guess was a little bit irresponsible with money and had run up ridiculous bills on the credit card of the other, actually took out a credit card in the other's name, almost committing fraud against the person they're living with. So you had all that in the mix. Known to have all kinds of arguments, known to have an argument the day before. With all that in the basket, it's hard to walk away from a case like this.
That's really true. And a prosecution team who gets to know the family of the people who, the person that died, they feel like they have an obligation to see the case through. If they feel like there's anything more that could possibly be done, or if there's something different that could be done with regard to the presentation, it's really hard to let something go. There's also always going to be the question of, they got this conviction one time, and even though it turned out to be something that the Court of Appeals reversed and said, nope, you got to go back and do it again and get this evidence in correctly, or don't get it in at all. They know that a group of jurors heard this same case and decided that she was guilty, which can make it harder to cut something loose.
Yeah, when you have these multiple times, Judge, to try a case, one of the things that happens is you get practice, right? You figure out what didn't go right the previous time. It's shocking to me that with all the evidence we're talking about, the thing that made a difference in the conviction was the paint expert.
Oh my gosh, that's what I had started to talk about. Not to interrupt you, but I completely agree with you. But for the state to think, okay, first time, second time, no, but third time, well, let's bring that in and see if it makes a difference. But I also think it's a pretty good argument to be able to say, well, the paint was wet, and argue that means it was used to cover up evidence, which is actually very smart by a criminal, whether it's this defendant or someone else.
Yeah, and the thing is, Nicole, okay, so I don't know if there's any established experts who could come in and testify to the drying of paint. Do you try to find an expert, or do you perform you get a crime scene reconstructionist, have them perform? Like, how do you go about getting that evidence in now that you know the person you called in the last trial is not good but was very effective?
Right.
Right, and such a great point. I mean, there are very specific rules that are supposed to be followed in a courtroom to make sure that jurors don't get information which is really unreliable. And we call that in the legal community the Kelly and Daubert standard, which are cases that sort of set forth the criteria that a court must consider in whether or not someone can come to court and say things that a lay person would not know. And so in doing this and formulating these opinions that ultimately would come into evidence, the court has to be sure that this person is formulating these opinions based on reliable, tested science that actually apply and are relevant to the facts and circumstances of the case in question. And there are some very specific things that the court has to hear about, some points about what sort of research was done. Has this research been tested in the community, and is it reliable? And do the facts of this case really hold up under that research and under the application that this expert is trying to make in making his opinion? So it's a technical inquiry. The court's going to have a hearing and determine whether or not someone can come in and say the things that this so-called expert said already once in one trial.
Yeah, I wonder how they attacked it in the previous trials, because to me it also seems like a normal common sense thing.
Yeah.
If you're telling me that this person died, at 12 or 1 o'clock, and the paint is still wet at 7 or 8 p.m., I mean, it just makes sense that the paint would be dry. If it's wet, something happened.
Yeah, I agree.
You know what I mean?
I agree.
I don't know how they approached it. Maybe they'll just approach it that way.